Florence. Till the end of the 13th century, this city had not made a mark as a center of trade or of learning, but things changed dramatically. 15th century. A city is known by its great citizens as much as by its wealth, and Florence had come to be known because of Dante Alighieri, 1265–1321, a layman who wrote on religious themes, and Giotto, 1267–1337, an artist who painted lifelike portraits, very different from the stiff figures done by earlier artists. From then it developed as the most exciting intellectual city in Italy and as a center of artistic creativity. The term, Renaissance man, is often used to describe a person with many interests and skills, because many of the individuals who became well known at this time were people of many parts. They were scholar, diplomat, theology and artist combined in one. The humanist view of history. Humanists thought that they were restoring true civilization after centuries of darkness, for they believed that a dark age had set in after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Following them, later scholars unquestioningly assumed that a new age had begun in Europe from the 14th century. The term Middle Ages, medieval period, was used for the millennium, 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. In the Middle Ages, they argued, the Church had had such complete control over men's minds that all the learning of the Greeks and Romans had been blotted out. The humanists used the word modern for the period from the 15th century. Recently, historians have questioned this division. With more research being done and more being found out about Europe in this period, scholars are increasingly reluctant to make sharp divisions between centuries in terms of being culturally vibrant or otherwise. It seems unfair to label any period as the Dark Ages. Periodization used by humanists and by later scholars 5th to 14th century. The Middle Ages. 5th to 9th century. The Dark Ages. 9th to 11th century. The Early Middle Ages. 11th to 14th century. The Late Middle Ages. 15th century onwards. The Modern Age. Science and philosophy, the Arawaks' contribution. Much of the writings of the Greeks and Romans had been familiar to monks and clergymen through the Middle Ages, but they had not made these widely known. In the 14th century, many scholars began to read translated works of Greek writers like Plato and Aristotle. For this they were indebted not to their own scholars but to Arab translators who had carefully preserved and translated ancient manuscripts. Plato was of Latin, and Aristotle Aristu in Arabic. While some European scholars read Greek and Arabic translation, the Greeks translated works of Arabic and Persian scholars for further transmission to other Europeans. These were works on natural science, mathematics, astronomy, medicine and chemistry. Ptolemy's Almagest, a work on astronomy, written in Greek before 140 CE and later translated into Arabic, carries the Arabic definite article, al, which brings out the Arabic connection. Among the Muslim writers who were regarded as men of wisdom in the Italian world were Ibn Sina, Avicenna, in Latin, 980–1037, an Arab physician and philosopher of Bukhara in Central Asia, and Al-Razi, Razes, author of a medical encyclopedia. Ibn Rushdi, Averroes in Latin, 1126–1198, an Arab philosopher of Spain, tried to resolve the tension between philosophical knowledge, falasuf, and religious beliefs. His method was adopted by Christian thinkers. Humanists reached out to people in a variety of ways. Though the curricula in universities continued to be dominated by law, medicine and theology, humanist subjects slowly began to be introduced in schools, not just in Italy but in other European countries as well. Artists and realism. Formal education was not the only way through which humanists shaped the minds of their age. Art, architecture and books were wonderfully effective in transmitting humanist ideas. Artists were inspired by studying works of the past. The material remains of Roman culture were sought with as much excitement as ancient texts. 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, fragments of art were discovered in the ruins of ancient Rome and other deserted cities. Their admiration for the figures of perfectly proportioned men and women sculpted so many centuries ago made Italian sculptors want to continue that tradition. In 1416, Donatello, 1386 to 1466, broke new ground with his lifelike statues. Artists concerned to be accurate was helped by the work of scientists. To study bone structures, artists went to the laboratories of medical schools. Andreas Vesalius, 1514 to 1564, a Belgian and a professor of medicine at the University of Padua, was the first to dissect the human body. This was the beginning of modern physiology. Painters did not have older works to use as a model. But they, like sculptors, painted as realistically as possible. They found that a knowledge of geometry helped them understand perspective, and that by noting the changing quality of light, their pictures acquired a three-dimensional quality. The use of oil as a medium for painting also gave a greater richness of color to paintings than before. In the colors and designs of costumes in many paintings, there is evidence of the influence of Chinese and Persian art, made available to them by the Mongols. Thus, anatomy, geometry, physics, as well as a strong sense of what was beautiful, gave a new quality to Italian art, which was to be called realism, and which continued till the 19th century. Architecture. The city of Rome revived in a spectacular way in the 15th century. From 1417, the popes were politically stronger because the weakness caused by the election of two rival popes since 1378 had ended. They actively encouraged the study of Rome's history. The ruins in Rome were carefully excavated by archaeologists. Archaeology was a new skill. This inspired a new style in architecture, which was actually a revival of the Imperial Roman style, now called classical. Popes, wealthy merchants and aristocrats employed architects who were familiar with classical architecture. Artists and sculptors were also to decorate buildings with paintings, sculptures and reliefs. Some individuals were skilled equally as painters, sculptors and architects. The most impressive example is Michelangelo Buonarrota, 1475 to 1564, immortalized by the ceiling he painted for the Pope in the Sistine Chapel, the sculpture called the Pietà, and his design of the dome of St. Peter's Church, all in Rome. Filippo Brunelleschi, 1337 to 1446, the architect who designed the spectacular Duomo of Florence, had started his career as a sculptor. Another remarkable change was that from this time, artists were known individually, by name, not as members of a group or a guild, as earlier. The first printed books. If people in other countries wanted to see paintings, sculptures or buildings of great artists, they had to travel to Italy. But in the case of the written word, what was written in Italy traveled to other countries. This was because of the greatest revolution of the 16th century, the mastery of the technology of printing. For this, Europeans were indebted to other peoples, the Chinese, for printing technology, and to Mongol rulers because European traders and diplomats had become familiar with it during visits to their courts. This was also the case with three other important innovations: firearms, the compass and the abacus. Earlier, texts existed in a few handwritten copies. In 1455, 150 copies of the Bible were printed in the workshop of Johann Gutenberg, 1400 to 1458, the German who made the first printing press. Earlier, a monk would have taken the same amount of time to write out one copy of the Bible. By 1500, many classical texts, nearly all in Latin, had been printed in Italy. As printed books became available, it was possible to buy them, and students did not have to depend solely on lecture notes. Ideas, opinions and information moved more widely and more rapidly than ever before. A printed book promoting new ideas could quickly reach hundreds of readers. This also made it possible for individuals to read books, since it was possible to buy copies for oneself. This developed the reading habit among people. The chief reason that the humanist culture of Italy spread more rapidly across the Alps from the end of the 15th century is that printed books were circulating. This also explains why earlier intellectual movements had been limited to particular regions. AEW concept of human beings. One of the features of humanist culture was a slackening of the control of religion over human life. Italians were strongly attracted to material wealth, power and glory, but they were not necessarily irreligious. Francesco Barbaro, 1390–1454, a humanist from Venice, wrote a pamphlet defending acquisition of wealth as a virtue. On pleasure, Lorenzo Valla, 1406–1457, who believed that the study of history leads man to strive for a life of perfection, criticized the Christian injunction against pleasure. There was also a concern at this time with good manners, how one should speak politely and dress correctly, what skills a person of culture should learn. Humanism also implied that individuals were capable of shaping their own lives through means other than the mere pursuit of power and money. This ideal was closely tied with the belief that human nature was many-sided, which went against the three separate orders that feudal society believed in. The aspirations of women, the new ideal of individuality and citizenship, excluded women. Men from aristocratic families dominated public life and were the decision-makers in their families. They educated their sons to take their place in family businesses or in public life, at times sending their younger sons to join the church. Although their dowries were invested in the family businesses, women generally had no say in how their husbands should run their business. Often, marriages were intended to strengthen business alliances. If an adequate dowry could not be arranged, daughters were sent to convents to live the life of a nun. Obviously, the public role of women was limited and they were looked upon as keepers of the households. The position of women in the families of merchants, however, was somewhat different. Shopkeepers were very often assisted by their wives in running the shop. In families of merchants and bankers, wives looked after the businesses when the male members were away on work. The early death of a merchant compelled his widow to perform a larger public role than was the case in aristocratic families. A few women were intellectually very creative and sensitive about the importance of a humanist education. Even though the study of letters promises and offers no reward for women and no dignity, wrote the Venetian Cassandra Fedele, 1465–1558, every woman ought to seek and embrace these studies. She was one of a handful of women who questioned the idea that women were incapable of achieving the qualities of a humanist scholar. Fedele was known for her proficiency in Greek and Latin, and was invited to give orations at the University of Padua. Fedele's writings bring into focus the general regard for education in that age. She was one of many Venetian women writers who criticized the Republic for creating a highly limited definition of freedom that favored the desires of men over those of women. Another remarkable woman was the Marchesa of Mantua, Isabella d'Este, 1474–1539. She ruled the state while her husband was absent, and the court of Mantua, a small state, was famed for its intellectual brilliance. Women's writings revealed their conviction that they should have economic power, property and education to achieve an identity in a world dominated by men. Debates within Christianity, trade and travel, military conquest and diplomatic contacts linked Italian towns and courts with the world beyond. The new culture was admired and imitated by the educated and the wealthy. Very few of the new ideas filtered down to the ordinary man who, after all, could not read or write. In the 15th and early 16th centuries, many scholars in universities in North Europe were attracted to humanist ideas. Like their Italian colleagues, they too focused on classical Greek and Roman texts along with the holy books of the Christians. But, unlike Italy, where professional scholars dominated the humanist movement, in North Europe humanism attracted many members of the Church. They called on Christians to practice religion in the way laid down in the ancient texts of their religion, discarding unnecessary rituals, which they condemned as later additions to a simple religion. Theirs was a radically new view of human beings as free and rational agents. Later philosophers were to return to this over and over again, inspired by the belief in a distant God who created man but allowed him complete freedom to live his life freely, in pursuit of happiness, here and now. Christian humanists like Thomas More, 1478–1535, in England and Erasmus, 1466–1536, in Holland felt that the Church had become an institution marked by greed, extorting money at will from ordinary people. One of the favorite methods of the clergy was to sell indulgences, documents which apparently freed the buyer from the burden of the sins he had committed. Christians came to realize from printed translations of the Bible in local languages that their religion did not permit such practices. In almost every part of Europe, peasants began to rebel against the taxes imposed by the church. While the common folk resented the extortions of churchmen, princes found their interference in the work of the state irritating. They were pleased when the humanists pointed out that the clergy's claim to judicial and fiscal powers originated from a document called the Donation of Constantine, supposed to have been issued by Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor. Humanist scholars were able to point out that this was not genuine, and had been forged later. In 1517, a young German monk called Martin Luther (1483–1546) launched a campaign against the Catholic Church and argued that a person did not need priests to establish contact with God. He asked his followers to have complete faith in God, for faith alone could guide them to the right life and entry into heaven. This movement, called the Protestant Reformation, led to the churches in Germany and Switzerland breaking their connection with the Pope and the Catholic Church. In Switzerland, Luther's ideas were popularized by Ulrich Zwingli (1484–1531) and later by Jean Calvin (1509–1564). Backed by merchants, the reformers had greater popular appeal in towns, while in rural areas the Catholic Church managed to retain its influence. Other German reformers, like the Anabaptists, were even more radical. They blended the idea of salvation with the end of all forms of social oppression. They said that since God had created all people as equal, they were not expected to pay taxes and had the right to choose their priests. This appealed to peasants oppressed by feudalism. Luther did not support radicalism. He called upon German rulers to suppress the peasants' rebellion, which they did in 1525. But radicalism survived, and merged with the resistance of Protestants. France, who, persecuted by the Catholic rulers, started claiming the right of a people to remove an oppressive ruler and to choose someone of their own liking. Eventually, in France, as in many other parts of Europe, the Catholic Church allowed Protestants to worship as they chose. In England, the rulers ended the connection with the Pope. The king, queen was from then onwards the head of the Church. The Catholic Church itself did not escape the impact of these ideas, and began to reform itself from within. In Spain and in Italy, churchmen emphasized the need for a simple life and service to the poor. In Spain, Ignatius Loyola, in an attempt to combat Protestantism, set up the Society of Jesus in 1540. His followers were called Jesuits, whose mission was to serve the poor and to widen their knowledge of other cultures. The 16th and 17th centuries 1516. Thomas More's Utopia published. 1517. Martin Luther writes the Ninety Five Theses. 1522. Luther translates the Bible into German. 1525. Peasant uprising in Germany. 1543. Andreas Vesalius writes on anatomy. 1559. Anglican Church established in England, with the king, queen as its head. 1569. Gerhardus Mercator prepares cylindrical map of the earth. 1582. Gregorian calendar introduced by Pope Gregory XIII. 1628. William Harvey links the heart with blood circulation. 1673. Academy of Sciences set up in Paris. 1687. Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica published. The Copernican revolution. The Christian notion of man as a sinner was questioned from an entirely different angle, by scientists. The turning point in European science came with the work of Copernicus, 1473–1543, a contemporary of Martin Luther. Christians had believed that the earth was a sinful place and the heavy burden of sin made it immobile. The earth stood at the center of the universe around which moved the celestial planets. Copernicus asserted that the planets, including the Earth, rotate around the Sun. A devout Christian, Copernicus was afraid of the possible reaction to his theory by traditionalist clergymen. For this reason, he did not want his manuscript, De Revolutionibus, The Rotation, to be printed. On his deathbed, he gave it to his follower, Joachim Rheticus. It took time for people to accept this idea. It was much later, more than half a century later, in fact, that the difference between heaven and earth was bridged through the writings of astronomers like Johannes Kepler, 1571–1630, and Galileo Galilei, 1564–1642. The theory of the Earth as part of a sun-centered system was made popular by Kepler's cosmographical mystery, which demonstrated that the planets move around the sun not in circles but in ellipses. Galileo confirmed the notion of the dynamic world in his work The Motion. This revolution in science reached its climax with Isaac Newton's theory of gravitation. Reading the universe, Galileo once remarked that the Bible that lights the road to heaven does not say much on how the heavens work. The work of these thinkers showed that knowledge, as distinct from belief, was based on observation and experiments. Once these scientists had shown the way, experiments and investigations into what came to be called physics, chemistry and biology expanded rapidly. Historians were to label this new approach to the knowledge of man and nature the scientific revolution. Consequently, in the minds of skeptics and non-believers, God began to be replaced by nature as the source of creation. Even those who retained their faith in God started talking about a distant God who does not directly regulate the act of living in the material world. Such ideas were popularized through scientific societies that established a new scientific culture in the public domain. The Paris Academy, established in 1670, and the Royal Society in London for the Promotion of Natural Knowledge, formed in 1662, held lectures and conducted experiments for public viewing. Was there a European Renaissance in the 14th century? Let us now reconsider the concept of the Renaissance. Can we see this period as marking a sharp break with the past and the rebirth of ideas from Greek and Roman traditions? Was the earlier period, 12th and 13th centuries, a time of darkness? Recent writers, like Peter Burke of England, have suggested that Burckhardt was exaggerating the sharp difference between this period and the one that preceded it, by using the term Renaissance, which implies that the Greek and Roman civilizations were reborn at this time, and that scholars and artists of this period substituted the pre-Christian worldview for the Christian one. Both arguments were exaggerated. Scholars in earlier centuries had been familiar with Greek and Roman cultures, and religion continued to be a very important part of people's lives. To contrast the Renaissance as a period of dynamism and artistic creativity, and the Middle Ages as a period of gloom and lack of development is an oversimplification. Many elements associated with the Renaissance in Italy can be traced back to the 12th and 13th centuries. It has been suggested by some historians that in the 9th century in France, there had been similar literary and artistic blossoming. The cultural changes in Europe at this time were not shaped only by the classical civilization of Rome and Greece. The archaeological and literary recovery of Roman culture did create a great admiration of that civilization. But technologies and skills in Asia had moved far ahead of what the Greeks and Romans had known. Much more of the world had become connected, and the new techniques of navigation enabled people to sail much further than had been possible earlier. The expansion of Islam and the Mongol conquests had linked Asia and North Africa with Europe, not politically but in terms of trade and of learning skills. The Europeans learned not just from the Greeks and Romans, but from India, from Arabia, from Iran, from Central Asia and China. These debts were not acknowledged for a long time because when the history of this period started to be written, historians saw it from a Europa-centered viewpoint. An important change that did happen in this period was that gradually the private and the public spheres of life began to become separate. The public sphere meant the area of government and of formal religion. The private sphere included the family and personal religion. The individual had a private as well as a public role. He was not simply a member of one of the three orders, he was also a person in his own right. An artist was not just a member of a guild, he was known for himself. In the 18th century, this sense of the individual would be expressed in a political form, in the belief that all individuals had equal political rights. Another development was that the different regions of Europe started to have their separate sense of identity, based on language. Europe, earlier united partly by the Roman Empire and later by Latin and Christianity, was now dissolving into states, each united by a common language. The city-state Cardinal Gaspare Contarini, 1483–1542, writes about the democratic government of his city-state in the Commonwealth and Government of Venice, 1534. To come to the institution of our Venetian Commonwealth, the whole authority of the city is in that council, into which all the gentlemen of the city being once past the age of 25 years are admitted. Now first I am to yield you a reckoning how and with what wisdom it was ordained by our ancestors, that the common people should not be admitted into this company of citizens, in whose authority lies the whole power of the Commonwealth. Because many troubles and popular tumults arise in those cities, whose government is swayed by the common people, many were of contrary opinion, deeming that it would do well, if this manner of governing the Commonwealth should rather be defined by ability and abundance of riches. Contrariwise the honest citizens, and those that are liberally brought up, oftentimes fall to poverty. Therefore our wise and prudent ancestors ordered that this definition of the public rule should go rather by the nobility of lineage, than by the estimation of wealth, yet with that temperature, proviso, that men of chief and supreme nobility should not have this rule alone, for that would rather have been the power of a few than a commonwealth, but also every other citizen whosoever not ignobly born, so that all which were noble by birth, or ennobled by virtue, did obtain this right of government. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, 1463–1494, a humanist of Florence, wrote on the importance of debate and on the dignity of man, 1486. For Plato and Aristotle, it was certain that, for the attainment of the knowledge of truth they were always seeking for themselves, nothing is better than to attend as often as possible the exercise of debate. For just as bodily energy is strengthened by gymnastic exercise, so beyond doubt in this wrestling place of letters, as it were, energy of mind becomes far stronger and more vigorous. Art is embedded in nature, he who can extract it, has it. Moreover, you may demonstrate much of your work by geometry. The more closely your work abides by life in its form, so much the better will it appear. No man shall ever be able to make a beautiful figure out of his own imagination unless he has well stored his mind by much copying from life. Albrecht Dürer, 1471–1528. This sketch by Dürer, Praying Hands, gives us a sense of Italian culture in the 16th century, when people were deeply religious, but also had a sense of confidence in man's ability to achieve near perfection and to unravel the mysteries of the world and the universe. Niccolò Machiavelli wrote about human nature in the 15th chapter of his book, The Prince, 1513. So, leaving aside imaginary things, and referring only to those which truly exist, I say that whenever men are discussed, and especially princes, who are more exposed to view, they are noted for various qualities which earn them either praise or condemnation. Some, for example, are held to be generous, and others miserly. Some are held to be benefactors, others are called grasping, some cruel, some compassionate, one man faithless, another faithful, one man effeminate and cowardly, another fierce and courageous, one man courteous, another proud, one man lascivious, another pure, one guileless, another crafty, one stubborn, another flexible, one grave, another frivolous, one religious, another skeptical, and so forth. Machiavelli believed that all men are bad and ever ready to display their vicious nature, partly because of the fact that human desires are insatiable. The most powerful motive Machiavelli saw as the incentive for every human action is self-interest. Balthasar Castiglione, author and diplomat, wrote in his book The Courtier, 1528, I hold that a woman should in no way resemble a man as regards her ways, manners, words, gestures and bearing. Thus just as it is very fitting that a man should display a certain robust and sturdy manliness, so it is well for a woman to have a certain soft and delicate tenderness, with an air of feminine sweetness in her every movement, which, in her going and staying and whatsoever she does, always makes her appear a woman, without any resemblance to a man. If this precept be added to the rules that these gentlemen have taught the courtier, then I think that she ought to be able to make use of many of them, and adorn herself with the finest accomplishments. For I consider that many virtues of the mind are as necessary to a woman as to a man, as it is to be of good family, to shun affectation, to be naturally graceful, to be well-mannered, clever and prudent, to be neither proud, envious or aviltinged, nor vain. To perform well and gracefully the sports suitable for women. William Tyndale, 1494–1536, an English Lutheran who translated the Bible into English in 1506, defended Protestantism thus: in this they be all agreed, to drive you from the knowledge of the Scripture, and that ye shall not have the text thereof in the mother tongue, and to keep the world still in darkness, to the intent they might sit in the consciences of the people, through vain superstition and false doctrine, to satisfy their proud ambition, and insatiable covetousness, and to exalt their own honor above king and emperor, yea, and above God himself. Which thing only moved me to translate the New Testament, because I had perceived by experience, how that it was impossible to establish the laypeople in any truth, except the Scripture were plainly laid before their eyes in their mother tongue, that they might see the process, order, and meaning of the text. The New Testament is the section of the Bible dealing with the life and teachings of Christ and his early followers. Celestial means divine or heavenly, while terrestrial implies having a worldly quality. Theme-8 Confrontation of Cultures. This chapter will examine some aspects of the encounters between Europeans and the people of the Americas between the 15th and the 17th centuries. Some Europeans ventured out on unknown oceans in order to find trading routes to areas where spices and silver were to be obtained. The first to do this were the Spanish and the Portuguese. They persuaded the Pope to give them the exclusive right to rule over any new regions they might locate. Christopher Columbus, an Italian, sponsored by the rulers of Spain, sailed west in 1492, and thought that the lands he had reached were the Indies, India and countries east of India about which he had read in the travels of Marco Polo. Later exploration indicated that the Indians of the EW world actually belonged to different cultural groups and were not part of Asia. Two types of culture were to be found in the Americas. There were small subsistence economies in the Caribbean region and in Brazil. There were also powerful monarchical systems based on well-developed agriculture and mining. These, like the Aztecs and Mayas of Central America and the Incas of Peru, also had monumental architecture. The exploration and later the settlement of South America were to have disastrous consequences for the native people and their cultures. It also marked the beginning of the slave trade, with Europeans selling slaves from Africa to work in plantations and mines in the Americas. European conquest of the people of America was accompanied by the ruthless destruction of their manuscripts and monuments. It was only in the late 19th century that anthropologists began to study these cultures. Still later, archaeologists found the ruins of these civilizations. The Inca city of Machu Picchu was rediscovered in 1911. Recently, photographs taken from the air have shown traces of many cities now covered by forest. By contrast, we know the European side of the encounters in great detail. The Europeans who went to the Americas kept logbooks and diaries of their journeys. There are records left by officials and Jesuit missionaries. Europeans wrote about their discovery of the Americas, and when histories of the countries of America were written, these were in terms of European settlements, with little reference to the local people. People have been living in North and South America and nearby islands for thousands of years, and many migrations from Asia and from the South Sea Islands have taken place over time. South America was, and still is, in parts, densely forested and mountainous, and the Amazon, the world's largest river, flows through miles of dense forest. In Mexico and Central America, there were densely settled areas of habitation along the coast and in the plains, while elsewhere villages were scattered over forested areas. Communities of the Caribbean and Brazil. The Arawakian Lucaos lived on a cluster of hundreds of small islands in the Caribbean Sea, today known as the Bahamas, and the Greater Antilles. They had been expelled from the Lesser Antilles by the Caribs, a fierce tribe. In contrast to them, the Arawaks were a people who preferred negotiation to conflict. Skilled boat builders, they sailed the open sea and dug out canoes made from hollow tree trunks. They lived by hunting, fishing, agriculture, growing corn, sweet potatoes, tubers, cassava. A central cultural value was the organization of people to produce food collectively and to feed everyone in the community. They were organized under clan elders. Polygamy was common. The Arawaks were animists. As in many other societies, shamans played an important role as healers and intermediaries between this world and that of the supernatural. The Arawaks used gold for ornaments, but did not attach the value to the metal that the Europeans did. They were quite happy to exchange gold for glass beads brought by the Europeans, because these seemed so much more beautiful. The art of weaving was highly developed, the hammock was one of their specialities, and one which captured the imagination of the Europeans. The Arawaks were generous and were happy to collaborate with the Spanish in their search for gold. It was when Spanish policy became brutal that they were forced to resist, but this was to have disastrous consequences for them. Within 25 years of contact with the Spanish, very little remained of the Arawaks or their way of life. People called the Tupinamba lived on the east coast of South America, and in villages in the forests. The name, Brazil, is derived from the Brazil wood tree. They could not clear the dense forests for cultivation as they had no access to iron. But they had a healthy and plentiful supply of fruits, vegetables and fish, and so did not have to depend on agriculture. The Europeans who met them envied their happy freedom, with no king, army or church to regulate their lives. The state systems of Central and South America, in contrast to the Caribbean and Brazil, there were some highly organized states in Central America. There was a generous surplus of corn, which provided the basis for the urbanized civilizations of the Aztecs, Mayas and Incas. The monumental architectural remains of these cities continue to mesmerize visitors today. The Aztecs in the 12th century, the Aztecs had migrated from the north into the central valley of Mexico, named after their god Mexitli. They expanded their empire by defeating different tribes, who were forced to pay tribute. Aztec society was hierarchical. The nobility included those who were nobles by birth, priests, and others who had been awarded the rank. The hereditary nobility were a small minority who occupied the senior positions in the government, the army and the priesthood. The nobles chose from among them a supreme leader who ruled until his death. The king was regarded as the representative of the sun on earth. Warriors, priests and nobles were the most respected groups, but traders also enjoyed many privileges and often served the government as ambassadors and spies. Talented artisans, physicians and wise teachers were also respected. Since land was limited, the Aztecs undertook reclamations. They made chinampas, artificial islands, in Lake Mexico, by weaving huge reed mats and covering them with mud and plants. Between these exceptionally fertile islands, canals were constructed on which, in 1325, was built the capital city Tenochtitlan. Its palaces and pyramids rose dramatically out of the lake. Because the Aztecs were frequently engaged in war, the most impressive temples were dedicated to the gods of war and the sun. The empire rested on a rural base. People cultivated corn, beans, squash, pumpkins, manioc root, potatoes and other crops. Land was owned not by individuals but by clans, which also organized public construction works. Peasants, like European serfs, were attached to lands owned by the nobility and cultivated them in exchange for part of the harvest. The poor would sometimes sell their children as slaves, but this was usually only for a limited period, and slaves could buy back their freedom. The Aztecs made sure that all children went to school. Children of nobility attended Calm-Cac and were trained to become military and religious leaders. All others went to the Tepech Kali in their neighborhood, where they learned history, myths, religion and ceremonial songs. Boys received military training as well as training in agriculture and the trades. Girls were trained in domestic skills. In the early 16th century, the Aztec Empire was showing signs of strain. This was largely to do with discontent among recently conquered peoples who were looking for opportunities to break free from central control. The Mayas. The Mayan culture of Mexico developed remarkably between the 11th and 14th centuries, but in the 16th century they had less political power than the Aztecs. Corn cultivation was central to their culture, and many religious ceremonies were centered on the planting, growing and harvesting of corn. Efficient agricultural production generated surplus, which helped the ruling classes, priests and chiefs to invest in architecture and in the development of astronomy and mathematics. The Mayas devised a pictographic form of writing that has only been partially deciphered. The Incas of Peru. The largest of the indigenous civilizations in South America was that of the Quichuas or Incas in Peru. In the 12th century the first Inca, Manco Capac, established his capital at Cuzco. Expansion began under the 9th Inca and at its maximum extent the Inca Empire stretched 3,000 miles from Ecuador to Chile. The empire was highly centralized, with the king representing the highest source of authority. Newly conquered tribes were absorbed effectively. Every subject was required to speak Quechua, the language of the court. Each tribe was ruled independently by a council of elders, but the tribe as a whole owed its allegiance to the ruler. At the same time, local rulers were rewarded for their military cooperation. Thus, like the Aztec Empire, the Inca Empire resembled a confederacy, with the Incas in control. There are no precise figures of the population, but it would seem that it included over 1 million people. Like the Aztecs, the Incas too were magnificent builders. They built roads through mountains from Ecuador to Chile. Their forts were built of stone slabs that were so perfectly cut that they did not require mortar. They used labor-intensive technology to carve and move stones from nearby rock falls. Masons shaped the blocks, using an effective but simple method called flaking. Many stones weighed more than 100 metric tons, but they did not have any wheeled vehicles to transport these. Labor was organized and very tightly managed. The basis of the Inca civilization was agriculture. To cope with the infertile soil conditions, they terraced hillsides and developed systems of drainage and irrigation. It has been recently pointed out that in 1500, cultivation in the Andean highlands was much greater than what it is today. The Incas grew corn and potatoes, and reared llamas for food and labor. Their weaving and pottery were of a high quality. They did not develop a system of writing. However, there was an accounting system in place, the quipu, or cords upon which knots were made to indicate specific mathematical units. Some scholars now suggest that the Incas wove a sort of code into these threads. The organization of the Inca Empire, with its pyramid-like structure, meant that if the Inca chief was captured, the chain of command could quickly come apart. This was precisely what happened when the Spaniards decided to invade their country. The cultures of the Aztecs and Incas had certain features in common, and were very different from European culture. Society was hierarchical, but there was no private ownership of resources by a few people, as in Europe. Though priests and shamans were accorded an exalted status, and large temples were built, in which gold was used ritually, there was no great value placed on gold or silver. This was also in marked contrast to contemporary European society. Voyages of exploration by Europeans. The people of South America and the Caribbean got to know of the existence of European people when the latter began to sail across the Atlantic Sea. The magnetic compass, which helped identify the cardinal points accurately, had been known since 1380, but only in the 15th century did people use it when they ventured on voyages into unknown areas. By this time many improvements had been made in European sailing ships. Larger ships were built, that could carry a huge quantity of cargo as well as equipment to defend themselves if attacked by enemy ships. The circulation of travel literature and books on cosmography and geography created widespread interest right through the 15th century. In 1477, Ptolemy's Geography, written 1,300 years earlier, became available in print and thus came to be widely read. According to Ptolemy, an Egyptian, the regions of the world were arranged in terms of latitudes and longitudes. Reading these texts gave Europeans some knowledge of the world, which they understood to have three continents, namely, Europe, Asia and Africa. Ptolemy had suggested that the world was spherical, but he underestimated the width of the oceans. Europeans had no idea of the distance they would have to travel in the Atlantic before they reached land. Since they imagined it would be a short voyage, there were many who were ready to venture forth recklessly beyond the known seas. People from the Iberian Peninsula, the Portuguese and the Spanish, were the pioneers in the 15th century voyages of exploration. For a long time these were called Voyages of Discovery. Later historians, however, argued that these were not the first voyages that people of the Old World made to lands unknown to them. Arabs, Chinese and Indians had navigated vast stretches of ocean, and sailors from the Pacific Islands, the Polynesians and Micronesians, had made major ocean crossings. The Vikings of Norway had reached North America in the 11th century. Why were Spanish and Portuguese rulers in particular so receptive to the idea of funding a maritime quest? What produced such a passion for gold and treasure and for glory and titles? One may find the answers in a combination of three motives: economic, religious and political. The European economy went through a decline from the mid-14th to the mid-15th centuries. Plague and wars led to depopulation in many parts of Europe, trade grew slack, and there was a shortage of gold and silver, used for making European coins. This situation was in stark contrast to the preceding period, from the 11th to the mid-14th centuries, when growing trade had supported Italian city-states and led to the accumulation of capital. In the late 14th century, long-distance trade declined, and then became difficult after the Turks conquered Constantinople in 1453. Italians managed to do business with Turks, but were now required to pay higher taxes on trade. The possibility that many more people could be brought into the fold of Christianity made many devout Christian Europeans ready to face adventure. As it happened, the Crusades against the Turks began as a religious war, but they increased Europe's trade with Asia and created a taste for the products of Asia, especially spices. If trade could be followed by political control, with European countries establishing colonies in regions with a warmer climate, they would benefit further. When thinking of new regions where gold and spices might be found, one possibility was West Africa, where Europeans had not traded directly so far. Portugal, a small country which had gained independence from Spain since 1139, and which had developed fishing and sailing skills, took the lead. Prince Henry of Portugal, called the Navigator, organized the coasting of West Africa and attacked Ceuta in 1415. After that, more expeditions were organized, and the Portuguese established a trading station in Cape Bojador in Africa. Africans were captured and enslaved, and gold dust yielded the precious metal. In Spain, economic reasons encouraged individuals to become knights of the ocean. The memory of the Crusades and the success of the Reconquista fanned private ambitions and gave rise to contracts known as capitulations. Under these contracts, the Spanish ruler claimed rights of sovereignty over newly conquered territories and gave rewards to leaders of expeditions in the form of titles and the right to govern the conquered lands. The Atlantic crossing Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506, was a self-taught man who sought adventure and glory. Believing in prophecies, he was convinced that his destiny lay in discovering a route to the east, the Indies, by sailing westwards. He was inspired by reading Imago Mundi, a work on astronomy and geography, by Cardinal Pierre Dailly written in 1410. He submitted his plans to the Portuguese crown, only to have them turned down. He had better luck with the Spanish authorities, who sanctioned a modest expedition that set sail from the port of Palos on the 3rd of August 1492. Nothing, however, prepared Columbus and his crew for the long Atlantic crossing that they embarked upon, or for the destination that awaited them. The fleet was small, consisting of a small NAO called Santa Maria, and 2 caravels, small light ships, named Pinta and Ina. Columbus himself commanded the Santa Maria along with 40 capable sailors. The outward journey enjoyed fair trade winds but was long. For 33 days, the fleet sailed without sight of anything but sea and sky. By this time, the crew became restive and some of them demanded that they turn back. On the 12th of October 1492, they sighted land. They had reached what Columbus thought was India, but which was the island of Guanahani in the Bahamas. It is said that this name was given by Columbus, who described the islands as surrounded by shallow seas, Baja Mar in Spanish. They were welcomed by the Arawaks, who were happy to share their food and provisions. In fact, their generosity made a deep impression upon Columbus. As he wrote in his logbook, they are so ingenuous and free with all they have, that no one would believe it who has not seen of it. Anything they possess, if it be asked of them, they never say no. On the contrary, they invite you to share it and show as much love as if their hearts went with it. Columbus planted a Spanish flag in Guanahani, which he renamed San Salvador, held a prayer service and, without consulting the local people, proclaimed himself viceroy. He enlisted their cooperation in pressing forward to the larger islands of Cubanascan, Cuba, which he thought was Japan, and Quisqueya, renamed Hispaniola, today divided between two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Gold was not immediately available, but the explorers had heard that it could be found in Hispaniola, in the mountain streams in the interior. But before they could get very far, the expedition was overtaken by accidents and had to face the hostility of the fierce Carib tribes. The men clamored to get back home. The return voyage proved more difficult as the ships were worm-eaten and the crew tired and homesick. The entire voyage took 32 weeks. 3 more voyages followed, in the course of which Columbus completed his explorations in the Bahamas and the Greater Antilles, the South American mainland and its coast. Subsequent voyages revealed that it was not the Indies that the Spaniards had found, but a new continent. Columbus' achievement had been to discover the boundaries of what seemed like infinite seas and to demonstrate that 5 weeks sailing with the trade wind took one to the other side of the globe. Since places are often given the names of individuals, it is curious that Columbus is commemorated only in a small district in the USA and in a country in northwestern South America, Colombia. Though he did not reach either of these areas. The 2 continents were named after Amerigo Vespucci, a geographer from Florence who realized how large they might be, and described them as the New World. The name, America, was first used by a German publisher in 1507. Voyages by Europeans. 1492. Columbus claims Bahama Islands and Cuba for Spain. 1494. The undiscovered world, divided between Portugal and Spain. 1497. John Cabot, Englishman, explores North American coast. 1498. Vasco da Gama reaches Calicut, Cory Code. 1499. Amerigo Vespucci sights South American coast. 1500. Cabral claims Brazil for Portugal. 1513. Balboa crosses Panama Isthmus, sights Pacific Ocean. 1521. Cortes defeats Aztecs. 1522. Magellan circumnavigates the globe. 1532. Pizarro conquers Inca Kingdom. 1571. Spanish conquer the Philippines. 1600. British East India Company formed. 1602. Dutch East India Company formed. Spain establishes an empire in America. Spanish expansion was based on a display of military strength with the use of gunpowder and of horses. The local people were compelled either to pay tribute or to work in gold and silver mines. The initial discovery was typically followed by establishing a small settlement, peopled by a few Spaniards who supervised the labor of the local inhabitants. Local chieftains were enlisted to explore new lands and, hopefully, more sources of gold. The greed for gold led to violent incidents provoking local resistance. The Spanish friar Bartolomé de las Casas, the most severe critic of the Spanish conquerors, observed that the Spanish often tested their swords on the naked flesh of the Arawaks. To military repression and forced labor was added the ravages of disease. The diseases of the Old World, Particularly smallpox wreaked havoc on the Arawaks, whose lack of immunity resulted in large-scale deaths. The local people imagined these diseases were caused by invisible bullets with which the Spaniards attacked them. The extinction of the Arawaks and all traces of their way of life is a silent reminder of their tragic encounter with Spaniards. The expeditions of Columbus were followed by a sustained and successful exploration of Central and South America. Within half a century, the Spanish had explored and laid claim to a vast area of the Western Hemisphere, from approximately latitudes 40 degrees north to 40 degrees south, without anyone challenging them. Before this, the Spanish conquered lands of two great empires of the region. This was largely the work of two individuals, Hernan Cortes, 1488–1547, and Francisco Pizarro, 1478–1541. Their explorations were financed by members of the landed gentry in Spain, officials of municipal councils and noblemen. Those joining the expeditions supplied their own equipment in exchange for a share of the booty they expected from the conquests. Cortes and the Aztecs. Cortes and his soldiers, called conquistadores, conquered Mexico swiftly and ruthlessly. In 1519, Cortes set sail from Cuba to Mexico, where he made friends with the Totonacs, a group who wanted to secede from Aztec rule. The Aztec king, Montezuma, sent an official to meet him. He was terrified at the aggressiveness of the Spanish, their gunpowder and their horses. Montezuma himself was convinced that Cortes was the reincarnation of an exiled god who had returned to avenge himself. The Spaniards pressed against the Tlaxcalans, fierce fighters who submitted only after a stiff resistance. The Spaniards proceeded to massacre them cruelly. Then they marched to Tenochtitlan, which they reached on the 8th of November 1519. The invading Spaniards were dumbstruck at the sight of Tenochtitlan. It was 5 times larger than Madrid and had 100,000 inhabitants, twice the population of Seville, Spain's largest city. Cortes was cordially received by Montezuma. The Aztecs led the Spaniards into the heart of the city, where the emperor showered them with gifts. His people were apprehensive, having heard of the massacre of the Tlaxcalans. An Aztec account described the situation. It was as though Tenochtitlan had given shelter to a monster. The people of Tenochtitlan felt as if everyone had eaten stupefying mushrooms. As if they had seen something astonishing. Terror dominated everyone, as if all the world were being disemboweled. People fell into a fearful slumber. The fears of the Aztecs proved to be well-founded. Cortes without any explanation placed the emperor under house arrest and attempted to rule in his name. In an attempt to formalize the emperor's submission to Spain, Cortes installed Christian images in the Aztec temple. Montezuma, on his part, suggested a compromise and placed both Aztec and Christian images in the temple. At this point, Cortes had to leave his deputy in charge and hurry back to Cuba. The high-handedness of the Spanish occupation and their incessant demands for gold provoked a general uprising. Alvarado ordered a massacre during the Aztec spring festival of Huizilpoctli. When Cortes returned on the 25th of June 1520, he had on his hands a full-blown crisis. The causeways were cut, the bridges taken away and the net closed. The Spaniards faced acute shortages of food and drinking water. Cortes was forced to retreat. Around this time, Montezuma died under mysterious circumstances. The Aztecs continued to fight the Spaniards. 600 conquistadores and many more of their Tlaxcalan allies were killed in what is known as the Night of Tears. Cortes was forced to retreat to Tlaxcala to plan his strategy against the newly elected king, Cuauhtémoc. By then, the Aztecs were dying from the dreaded smallpox which had come with the Europeans. With just 180 soldiers and 30 horses, Cortes moved into Tenochtitlan as the Aztecs prepared for their final stand. The Aztecs thought they could see omens foretelling that their end was near, and because of this the emperor chose to give up his life. The conquest of Mexico had taken 2 years. Cortes became Captain General of New Spain in Mexico and was showered with honors by Charles V. From Mexico, the Spaniards extended their control over Guatemala, Nicaragua and the Honduras. Pizarro and the Incas. Pizarro, in contrast to Cortes, was uneducated and poor when he joined the army and found his way to the Caribbean islands in 1502. He had heard stories about the Inca kingdom as a land of silver and gold, El Dorado. He made repeated attempts to reach it from the Pacific. On one of his journeys back home, he was able to meet the Spanish king and show him beautifully designed gold jars of Inca workmanship. The king's greed was aroused, and he promised Pizarro the governorship of the Inca lands if he conquered it. Pizarro planned to follow Cortes' method, but was disconcerted to find that the situation in the Inca Empire was different. In 1532, Atahualpa secured the throne of the Inca Empire after a civil war. Pizarro arrived on scene and captured the king after setting a trap for him. The king offered a room full of gold as ransom for his release, the most extravagant ransom recorded in history, but Pizarro did not honor his promise. He had the king executed, and his followers went on a looting spree. This was followed by the occupation of the country. The cruelty of the conquerors provoked an uprising in 1534 that continued for 2 years, during which time thousands died in war and due to epidemics. In another 5 years, the Spanish had located the vast silver mines in Potosi, in Upper Peru, modern Bolivia, and to work these they made the Inca people into slaves. Cabral and Brazil. The Portuguese occupation of Brazil occurred by accident. In 1500, a grand procession of ships set out from Portugal for India, headed by Pedro Alvarez Cabral. To avoid stormy seas, he made a wide loop around West Africa, and found to his surprise that he had reached the coast of present-day Brazil. As it happened, this eastern part of South America was within the section assigned on the map to Portugal by the Pope, so they regarded it as indisputably theirs. The Portuguese were more eager to increase their trade with Western India than with Brazil, which did not promise any gold. But there was one natural resource there which they exploited: timber. The Brazilwood tree, after which the Europeans named the region, produced a beautiful red dye. The natives readily agreed to cut the trees and carry the logs to the ships in exchange for iron knives and saws, which they regarded as marvels. For one sickle, knife or comb, they would bring loads of hens, monkeys, parrots, honey, wax, cotton thread and whatever else these poor people had. Why do you people, French and Portuguese, come from so far away to seek wood? Do not you have wood in your country? A native asked a French priest. At the end of their discussion, he said, I can see that you are great madmen. You cross the sea and suffer great inconvenience and work so hard to accumulate riches for your children. Is the land that nourished you not sufficient to feed them too? We have fathers, mothers and children whom we love. But we are certain that after our death the land that nourished us will also feed them. We therefore rest without further cares. This trade in timber led to fierce battles between Portuguese and French traders. The Portuguese won because they decided to settle in, colonize the coast. In 1534, the King of Portugal divided the coast of Brazil into 14 hereditary captaincies. To the Portuguese who wanted to live there he gave land ownership rights, and the right to make the local people into slaves. Many Portuguese settlers were veterans of the wars in Goa, in India, and were brutal to the local people. In the 1540s, the Portuguese began to grow sugarcane on large plantations and built mills to extract sugar, which was then sold in Europe. In this very hot and humid climate they depended on the natives to work the sugar mills. When the natives refused to do this exhausting and dreary work, the mill owners resorted to kidnapping them to work as slaves. The natives kept retreating into the forests to escape the slavers and, as time went on, there were hardly any native villages on the coast. Instead, there were large, well-laid-out European towns. Plantation owners were then forced to turn to another source for slaves, West Africa. This was a contrast to the Spanish colonies. A large part of the population in the Aztec and Inca empires had been used to laboring in mines and fields, so the Spanish did not need to formally enslave them or to look elsewhere for slaves. In 1549, a formal government under the Portuguese king was established, with the capital in Bahia, Salvador. From this time, Jesuits started to go out to Brazil. European settlers disliked them because they argued for humane interaction with the natives, ventured into the forests to live in villages, and sought to teach them Christianity as a joyous religion. Above all, the Jesuits strongly criticized slavery. Conquest, colonies and the slave trade. What had begun as uncertain voyages came to have lasting consequences for Europe, the Americas and Africa. From the 15th century, European maritime projects produced knowledge of continuous sea passages from ocean to ocean. Before this, most of these passages had been unknown to Europeans. Some were not known to anyone. No ship had penetrated the Caribbean or the Americas. The South Atlantic was wholly unexplored. No seagoing ship had ever entered its waters, much less crossed it, or sailed from it to the Pacific or the Indian Ocean. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, all these feats were accomplished. For Europe, the discovery of the Americas had consequences for others besides the initial voyagers. The influx of gold and silver helped further expansion of international trade and industrialization. Between 1560 and 1600, 100 ships each year carried silver from South American mines to Spain. But it was not Spain and Portugal that benefited. They did not invest their huge income in further trade, or in building up a merchant navy. Instead, it was the countries bordering the Atlantic, particularly England, France, Belgium and Holland, that took advantage of the discoveries. Their merchants formed joint stock companies and sent out trading expeditions, established colonies and introduced Europeans to the products of the New World, including tobacco, potatoes, cane sugar, cacao and rubber. Europe also became familiar with new crops from America, notably potatoes and chilies. These were then taken by Europeans to other countries like India. For the native people of the Americas, the immediate consequences were the physical decimation of local populations, the destruction of their way of life and their enslavement in mines, plantations and mills. Estimates indicate that pre-conquest Mexico had a population of between 30 and 37.5 million, the Andean region a similar number while Central America had between 10 and 13 million. The natives on the eve of the arrival of the Europeans totaled 70 million. A century and a half later, they had reduced to 3.5 million. Warfare and disease were primarily responsible for this. The sudden destruction of the two major civilizations, those of the Aztecs and the Incas, in America highlights the contrasts between the two cultures in combat. Both with the Aztecs and the Incas, the nature of warfare played a crucial role in terrorizing local inhabitants psychologically and physically. The contest also revealed a fundamental difference in values. The Spanish avarice for gold and silver was incomprehensible to the natives. The enslavement of the population was a sharp reminder of the brutality of the encounter. Slavery was not a new idea, but the South American experience was new in that it accompanied the emerging capitalist system of production. Working conditions were horrific, but the Spanish regarded the exploitation as essential to their economic gain. In 1601, Philip II of Spain publicly banned forced labor, but made arrangements by a secret decree for its continuation. Things came to a head with the law of 1609, which gave full freedom to the local people, Christian and non-Christian alike. The European settlers were enraged, and within 2 years they had forced the king to revoke this law and to permit enslavement once again. As new economic activities began, cattle farming on lands cleared of forests, and mining after the discovery of gold in 1700, the demand for cheap labor continued. It was clear that the local people would resist enslavement. The alternative was to turn to Africa. Between the 1550s and 1880s, when slavery was abolished in Brazil, over 3,600,000 African slaves were imported into Brazil. This was almost half the total number of African slaves imported into the Americas. In 1750, there were individuals who owned as many as 1,000 slaves. From early debates in 1780s on abolishing slavery, were those who argued that slavery existed in Africa prior to entry of Europeans, indeed slaves formed bulk of labor force in the states being formed in Africa from the 15th century. They also pointed out that European traders were helped by Africans who helped capture young men and women to be sold as slaves, in return for crops imported from South America, maize, manioc and cassava, which became their staple foods. In his autobiography, 1789, the freed slave Olaudah Equiano replied to these arguments by saying that slaves in Africa were treated as part of the family. In the 1940s, in his book Capitalism and Slavery, Eric Williams was one of the first modern historians to initiate a reassessment of the suffering experienced by African slaves. Epilogue. In the early 19th century, European settlers in the South American colonies were to rebel against Spain and Portugal and become independent countries, just as in 1776 the 13 North American colonies rebelled against Britain and formed the United States of America. South America today is also called Latin America. This is because Spanish and Portuguese, two of the main languages of the continent, are part of the Latin family of languages. The inhabitants are mostly native European, called Creole, European, and African by origin. Most of them are Catholics. Their culture has many elements of native traditions mixed with European ones. Animists believe that even objects regarded by modern science as inanimate may have life or a soul. Reclamation is the conversion of wasteland into land suitable for habitation or cultivation. Most visitors today wonder at the arts and skills of the Incas. However, there are some like the Chilean poet Neruda, who thought of the hours of hard work that thousands of people must have been forced to put in. And all that to achieve such high levels of agricultural output, such remarkable architecture, and such exquisite crafts, in this difficult environment. Look at me from the depths of the earth, tiller of fields, weaver, reticent shepherd, mason high on your treacherous scaffolding, iceman of Andean tears, jeweler with crushed fingers, farmer anxious among his seedlings, potter wasted among his clays, bring to the cup of this new life your ancient buried sorrows. Show me your blood and your furrow, say to me, here I was scourged because a gem was dull or because the earth failed to give up in time its tithe of corn or stone. Pablo Neruda, 1904-73, The Heights of Machu Picchu, 1943. Cosmography was understood as the science of mapping the universe. It described both heaven and earth, but was seen as distinct from geography and astronomy. Reconquista was the military reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula by Christian kings from the Arabs in 1492. Now means a heavy ship in Spanish. It is derived from Arabic, and this is explained by the fact of Arab occupation of the region till 1492. Viceroy means in place of the king, in this case the King of Spain. Dona Marina Bernard Diaz del Castillo, 1495-1584, wrote in his True History of the Conquest of Mexico that the people of Tabasco gave courts a woman attendant called Dona Marina. She was fluent in 3 local languages, and was able to play a crucial role as interpreter for courts. This was the great beginning of our conquests, and without Dona Marina we could not have understood the language of New Spain and Mexico. Diaz thought she was a princess, but the Mexicans called her Malinche, a word meaning betrayal. Malinchista means someone who slavishly copies the costumes and language of another people. Bernard Diaz wrote, and when we saw all those cities and villages built in the water, and other towns on dry land, and that straight and level causeway leading to Mexico City, we were astounded. These great towns and buildings rising from the water all made of stone, seemed like an enchanted vision from the tale of Amadis. Indeed, some of our soldiers asked whether it was not a dream. The capitalist system of production is one in which the means of production and distribution are owned by individuals or corporates and where competitors participate in a free market. The silver mines in Peru began to function in the 1550s, and the monk Domenico de Santo Tomas reported to the Council of the Indies that the Potosi was a mouth of hell which swallowed Indians by the thousands every year and that greedy mine owners treated them like stray animals. 4. Towards modernization. The Industrial Revolution. Displacing indigenous peoples. Paths to modernization. Towards modernization. In the previous section you have read about certain crucial developments in the medieval and early modern world: feudalism, the European Renaissance, and the encounters between Europeans and the peoples of the Americas. As you would have realized, some of the phenomena that contributed to the making of our modern world gradually evolved in this period, and especially so from the mid-15th century onwards. Two further developments in world history created a context for what has been called modernization. These were the Industrial Revolution and a series of political revolutions that transformed subjects into citizens, beginning with the American Revolution, 1776 to 1781, and the French Revolution, 1789 to 1794. Britain has been the world's first industrial nation, and you will read about how this came to be in Theme 9. For long it was believed that British industrialization provided the model for industrialization in other countries. The discussion of Theme 9 will show how historians have begun to question some of the earlier ideas about the Industrial Revolution. Each country drew upon the experiences of other nations, without necessarily reproducing any model. In Britain, for instance, coal and cotton textile industries were developed in the first phase of industrialization, while the invention of railways initiated the second stage of that process. In other countries such as Russia, which began to industrialize much later, from the late 19th century onwards, the railway and other heavy industry emerged in the initial phase of industrialization itself. Likewise, the role of the state, and of banks, in industrialization has differed from country to country. The treatment of the British case in Theme 9 will hopefully whet your curiosity about the industrial trajectories of other nations such as the USA and Germany, two significant industrial powers. Theme 9 also emphasizes the human and material costs incurred by Britain on its industrialization, the plight of the laboring poor, especially of children, environmental degradation, and the consequent epidemics of cholera and tuberculosis. In Theme 11 you will similarly read about industrial pollution and cadmium and mercury poisoning in Japan that stirred people into mass movements against indiscriminate industrialization. European powers began to colonize parts of America and Asia and South Africa well before the Industrial Revolution. Theme 10 tells you the story of what European settlers did to the native peoples of America and Australia. The bourgeois mentality of the settlers made them buy and sell everything, including land and water. But the natives, who appeared uncivilized to European Americans, asked, "If you do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can one buy them?" The natives did not feel the need to own land, fish or animals. They had no desire to commodify them. If things needed to be exchanged, they could simply be gifted. Quite obviously, the natives and the Europeans represented competing notions of civilization. The former did not allow the European deluge to wipe out their cultures, although the US and Canadian governments of the mid-20th century desired natives to join the mainstream, and the Australian authorities of the same period attempted to simply ignore their traditions and culture. One might wonder what is meant by mainstream. How does economic and political power influence the making of mainstream cultures? Western capitalism's mercantile, industrial and financial, and early 20th century Japanese capitalism created colonies in large parts of the Third World. Some of these were settler colonies. Others, such as British rule in India, are examples of direct imperial control. The case of 19th and early 20th century China illustrates a third variant of imperialism. Here Britain, France, Germany, Russia, America and Japan meddled in Chinese affairs without directly taking over state power. They exploited the country's resources to their own advantage, seriously compromising Chinese sovereignty and reducing the country to the status of a semi-colony. Almost everywhere, colonial exploitation was challenged by powerful nationalist movements. Nationalisms, however, also arose without a colonial context, as in the West or Japan. All nationalisms are doctrines of popular sovereignty. Nationalist movements believe that political power should rest with the people, and this is what makes nationalism a modern concept. Civic nationalism vests sovereignty in all people regardless of language, ethnicity, religion or gender. It seeks to create a community of rights-exercising citizens and defines nationhood in terms of citizenship, not ethnicity or religion. Ethnic and religious nationalisms try to build national solidarities around a given language, religion or set of traditions, defining the people ethnically, not in terms of common citizenship. In a multi-ethnic country, ethnic nationalists might limit the exercise of sovereignty to a chosen people, often assumed to be superior to minority communities. Today, most Western countries define their nationhood in terms of common citizenship and not by common ethnicity. One prominent exception is Germany, where ideas of ethnic nationalism have had a long and troubling career going back to the reaction against the French imperial occupation of German states in. Ideologies of civic nationalism have vied with those of ethnic, religious nationalism the world over, and this has been so in modern India, China and Japan as well. As with industrialization, so with paths to modernization. Different societies have evolved their distinctive modernities. The Japanese and Chinese cases are very instructive in this regard. Japan succeeded in remaining free of colonial control and achieved fairly rapid economic and industrial progress throughout the 20th century. The rebuilding of the Japanese economy after a humiliating defeat in the Second World War should not be seen as a mere post-war miracle. As Theme 11 shows, it resulted from certain gains that had already been accomplished in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Did you know, for instance, that by 1910 tuition fees for studying at a primary school had more or less ended and enrollment had become universal? The Japanese path to modernization, nevertheless, like that of any other country, has had its own tensions, those between democracy and militarism, ethnic nationalism and civic nation building, and between what many Japanese describe as tradition and westernization. The Chinese resisted colonial exploitation and their own bureaucratic landed elite through a combination of peasant rebellion, reform and revolution. By the early 1930s, the Chinese Communist Party, which drew its strength from peasant mobilization, had begun confronting the imperial powers as well as the nationalists who represented the country's elite. They had also started to implement their ideas in selected pockets of the country. Their egalitarian ideology, stress on land reforms and awareness of women's problems helped them overthrow foreign imperialism and the nationalists in 1949. Once in power, they succeeded in reducing inequalities, spreading education and creating political awareness. Even so, the country's single-party framework and state repression contributed to considerable dissatisfaction with the political system after the mid-1960s. But the Communist Party has been able to retain control over the country largely because, in embracing certain market principles, it reinvented itself and has worked hard to transform China into an economic powerhouse. The different ways in which various countries have understood modernity and sought to achieve it, each in the context of its own circumstances and ideas, make a fascinating story. This section introduces you to some aspects of that story. Timeline. c. 1700 to 2000. This timeline will give you an idea of what was happening in different parts of the world in the last 3 centuries, and how people in different countries contributed to the making of our modern world. It will tell you about the slave trade in Africa and the establishment of the apartheid regime in South Africa, about social movements in Europe and the formation of nation-states, about the expansion of imperial powers and the process of colonization, and about democratic and anti-colonial movements that swept through the world in the last century. It will also refer to some of the inventions and technological developments that are associated with modernity. As with all timelines, this one focuses on a few dates. There are others that are important. When you see a series of dates in a timeline, do not think that those are the only dates you need to know. Find out why different timelines focus on different types of dates, and what this selection tells us. Dates: Africa 1720 to 30. King Agaja of Dahomey, 1724-34, West Africa, stops slave trade. It is reintroduced in the 1740-1750-2. The first outbreak of smallpox, 1755, brought by sailors, in Cape Town, South Africa, 1770-1780. Peak of international slave trade, all the colonial powers are involved in it. Several 100,000 black Africans are taken across the Atlantic every year. As many as 2/3 die on board ship itself. 1800 to 1810 Muhammad Ali rules Egypt, 1805 to 48, Egypt breaks away from Ottoman Empire. 1820 to 30. Liberia founded, 1822, in West Africa as home for freed slaves. 1830 to 40. Abd al-Qadir leads Arab resistance, 1832 to 1847, against French presence in Algeria. Dates. Europe. 1730 to 40. Carolus Linnaeus invents a taxonomic system to classify plants and animals, 1735. 1770 to 1780. Emelian Pugachev heads a peasant uprising, 1773 to 1775, that sweeps across Russia. 1780 to 90. The beginning of the French Revolution, 1789. 1820 to 30 Louis Braille develops a system of finger reading, 1823, passenger trains introduced in England, 1825. 1840 to 50 liberal and socialist movements in several European countries, 1848. Dates Africa 1860 to 70. Suez Canal, one of the most important trade routes in the world, opens, 1869. 1880 to 90, 1880 to 90, beginning of the European scramble for Africa, 1900 to 1910, Mahatma Gandhi advocates satyagraha to resist racist laws, 1906, 1910 to 1920. South Africa introduces laws to reserve 87% of land for whites, 1913, 1932. First trans to African railway from Angola to Mozambique completed, 1931. 1940 to 50, Afrikaner National Party wins power in South Africa, 1948, the policy of apartheid is put in place 1950 to 60, Ghana is the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to become independent, 1957, 1960 to 70, Organization of African Unity founded, 1963, 1990 to 2000 Nelson Mandela freed in South Africa, 1990, process of dismantling apartheid begins. Europe 1860 to 70, Russian serfs are freed, 1861, 1870 to 80, Germany and Italy emerge as unified nation to states, 1890 to 1900, the making of the first film, 1895, the modern Olympics are held for the first time in Athens 1896-1910 to 1920, World War First, 1914 to 1918, the Russian Revolution of 1917, 1920 to 30, Turkey becomes a republic under Mustafa Kemal, 1923, 1930 to 40. Hitler captures power in Germany, 1933, World War II, 1939 to 45, 1942. Britain recognizes Irish independence, 1949, 1950 to 60. Discovery of DNA, Russia launches the spacecraft Sputnik, 1957, 1960 to 70. Protest movements in Europe, 1968, 1970 to 80. Mikhail Gorbachev, leader of the USSR, 1985. Beginning of the World Wide Web, 1989, 1990 to 2000. Scientists clone the sheep dolly, 1997, raising new debates about the limits of genetic engineering. Dates. Asia. Gujin Tushu Jicheng, the largest encyclopedia ever printed, commissioned by Kangxi, the Manchu ruler of China, 1750 to 1760. Aoki Kanya, a Japanese scholar compiles a Dutch-Japanese dictionary, 1758, 1780 to 90. The British export of opium from India to China expands dramatically, 1820 to 30. Javanese revolt against Dutch, 1825–30, 1830–40. Ottoman Sultan Abdulmajid starts a program of modernization, 1839, 1850–60. King Rama IV rules Thailand, opens the country to foreign trade, 1860–70. French begin to occupy Indo-China, Southeast Asia, 1862, 1870–80. Opening of the first Japanese railway, Tokyo to Yokohama, 1880–90. Britain annexes Burma, Myanmar, 1885–86. South Asia 1740–1750. The Marathas extend control over northern India, 1750–1760. Robert Clive defeats Siraj ud Daula, Nawab of Bengal, at Battle of Plassey. Ranjit Singh founds Sikh kingdom in Punjab. Practice of sati made illegal. Railway and telegraph line introduced, 1853, the Great Revolt, 1857. Famine in the Deccan, southern India, 1876–78, over 5 million die. Foundation of Indian National Congress, 1885. Asia. 1900–1910. Japanese Navy defeats Russian fleet, 1905, 1910–1920. Balfour Declaration promises homeland for Jews in Palestine, 1930–40. Opening of British oil pipeline from Iraq to Syria, 1934, 1940–50. United States of America drops atomic bombs on Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945, killing approximately 120,000 civilians. Many more were to die later on through the effects of radiation. Formation of People's Republic of China, 1949, 1950–60. Bandung Conference, 1955, strengthens the non-to-aligned movement. 1960–70. Arab leaders set up Palestine Liberation Organization to unite Palestinian refugees. 1964, War in Vietnam. 1965–73, 1970–80. The Shah of Iran is overthrown. 1980–90. Mass demonstrations for democracy in Tiananmen Square, Beijing, China. 1990–2000. The Gulf War between Iraq, Kuwait and the United States of America. Dates: South Asia, 1920–30, Non-to-Cooperation Movement, 1921, launched by Mahatma Gandhi. E. Ramaswamy Naikar launches the Self-Respect Movement in Tamil Nadu, 1925, 1930–40. Alamara by Ardashir Irani, 1931, is the first Indian talkie, 1940–50. Quit India Movement, 1942, India and Pakistan become independent, 1947. India becomes a republic. Sirimavo Bandar Naik becomes the world's first woman prime minister. Bangladesh emerges as an independent nation. A leak at the Union Carbide pesticides plant in Bhopal, 1984, leads to one of the worst industrial disasters in history. Thousands die. India and Pakistan conduct nuclear tests. America's 1720–30. The Portuguese introduce coffee in Brazil, 1727. The Portuguese introduce coffee in Brazil, 1727. 1730–40. The Stono slave rebellion led by illiterate slave Jemmy, 1739. 1740–1750. Juan Santos, also called Atahualpa II, leads Native Americans of Peru in unsuccessful revolt, 1742. 1760–1770. Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa tribe leads protest against the British, 1763, as Declaration of Independence. As Constitution drawn up, dollars are first used as American currency. Simon Bolivar leads Venezuela to independence. Trail of Tears. In the USA, thousands of Eastern Native Americans are forced to move west, many dying on the way. Meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, calls for equal rights for American women. Australia, Pacific Isla DS 1720–30. Dutch navigator Roggeveen reaches Samoa Islands and Easter Island in the Pacific, 1722. 1760–1770. First of British Captain James Cook's 3 voyages to Pacific, 1768–71. 1782. First British convicts shipped to Botany Bay, Australia, 1788. 1800 to 1810. Matthew Flinders circumnavigates, then names, Australia, it means, southern, 1801 to 03, 1830 to 40. Charles Darwin sets out on voyage to Pacific, Galapagos Islands, 1831, leading to the development of the theory of evolution, 1840 to 50. British and Maoris in New Zealand sign Treaty of Waitangi, 1840. This was followed by a series of Maori uprisings, 1844 to 88. Beginning of the first regular steamship service between Australia and England, Americas 1860 to 70. Civil War in USA, 1861 to 65. 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlaws slavery, 1870 to 80. Invention of telephone, record to player, electric bulb, 1880 to 90. Invention of Coca-Cola, 1886. 1900 to 1910. Wright brothers invent the aeroplane, 1903, 1910 to 1920. Henry Ford begins assembly line production of cars, 1913. Panama Canal linking the Atlantic and Pacific opened, 1914, 1920 to 30. As Wall Street Stock Exchange crashes, 1929. Great Depression follows. By 1932, 12 million are out of work, 1940 to 50. The Centers World War II, 1950 to 60. Fidel Castro comes to power after the Cuban Revolution, 1958. 1960 to 70. Civil Rights Movement in the USA, 1963. As Civil Rights Act, 1964, bans racial discrimination. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King is assassinated, 1968. Us astronauts land on the moon, 1969. 1970 to 80. As Congress passes Equal Opportunity Act in response to women's movement, 1972. Dates Australia, Pacific Island DS 1860 to 70. Transportation of prisoners to Australia from Britain ends. Votes for women in New Zealand. Influenza epidemic kills 1/5 of population of Western Samoa, 1918. Uprising of Mo people of Samoa against New Zealand government, 1970 to 80. Tonga and Fiji gain independence from Britain. Papua New Guinea gains independence from Australia, 1980 to 90. New Zealand declared a nuclear to free zone, 1984. Treaty of Rarotonga sets up South Pacific nuclear to free zone. Theme 9. The Industrial Revolution. The transformation of industry and the economy in Britain between the 1780s and the 1850s is called the First Industrial Revolution. This had far-reaching effects in Britain. Later, similar changes occurred in European countries and in the USA. These were to have a major impact on the society and economy of those countries and also on the rest of the world. This phase of industrial development in Britain is strongly associated with new machinery and technologies. These made it possible to produce goods on a massive scale compared to handicraft and handloom industries. The chapter outlines the changes in the cotton and iron industries. Steam, a new source of power, began to be used on a wide scale in British industries. Its use led to faster forms of transportation, by ships and railways. Many of the inventors and businessmen who brought about these changes were often neither personally wealthy nor educated in basic sciences like physics or chemistry, as will be seen from glances into the backgrounds of some of them. Industrialization led to greater prosperity for some, but in the initial stages it was linked with poor living and working conditions of millions of people, including women and children. This sparked off protests, which forced the government to enact laws for regulating conditions of work. The term, Industrial Revolution, was used by European scholars, Georges Michelet in France and Friedrich Engels in Germany. It was used for the first time in English by the philosopher and economist Arnold Toynbee, 1852-83, to describe the changes that occurred in British industrial development between 1760 and. These dates coincided with those of the reign of George III, on which Toynbee was giving a series of lectures at Oxford University. His lectures were published in 1884, after his untimely death, as a book called Lectures on the Industrial Revolution in England, Popular Addresses, Oates and Other Fragments. Later historians, T.S. Ashton, Paul Mantua and Eric Hobsbawm, broadly agreed with Toynbee. There was remarkable economic growth from the 1780s to 1820 in the cotton and iron industries, in coal mining, in the building of roads and canals and in foreign trade. Ashton, 1889–1968, celebrated the Industrial Revolution, when England was swept by a wave of gadgets. Why Britain? Britain was the first country to experience modern industrialization. It had been politically stable since the 17th century, with England, Wales and Scotland unified under a monarchy. This meant that the kingdom had common laws, a single currency and a market that was not fragmented by local authorities levying taxes on goods that passed through their area, thus increasing their price. By the end of the 17th century, money was widely used as the medium of exchange. By then a large section of the people received their income in the form of wages and salaries rather than in goods. This gave people a wider choice for ways to spend their earnings and expanded the market for the sale of goods. In the 18th century, England had been through a major economic change, later described as the Agricultural Revolution. This was the process by which bigger landlords had bought up small farms near their own properties and enclosed the village common lands, thus creating very large estates and increasing food production. This forced landless farmers, and those who had lived by grazing animals on the common lands, to search for jobs elsewhere. Most of them went to nearby towns. Trade and finance. From the 18th century, many towns in Europe were growing in area and in population. Out of the 19 European cities whose population doubled between 1750 and 1800, 11 were in Britain. The largest of them was London, which served as the hub of the country's markets, with the next largest ones located close to it. London had also acquired a global significance. By the 18th century, the center of global trade had shifted from the Mediterranean ports of Italy and France to the Atlantic ports of Holland and Britain. Still later, London replaced Amsterdam as the principal source of loans for international trade. London also became the center of a triangular trade network that drew in England, Africa and the West Indies. The companies trading in America and Asia also had their offices in London. In England, the movement of goods between markets was helped by a good network of rivers, and an indented coastline with sheltered bays. Until the spread of railways, transport by waterways was cheaper and faster than by land. As early as 1724, English rivers provided some 1,160 miles of navigable water, and except for mountainous areas, most places in the country were within 15 miles of a river. Since all the navigable sections of English rivers flow into the sea, cargo on river vessels was easily transferred to coastal ships called coasters. By 1800, at least 100,000 sailors worked on the coasters. The center of the country's financial system was the Bank of England, founded in 1694. By 1784, there were more than 100 provincial banks in England, and during the next 10 years their numbers trebled. By the 1820s, there were more than 600 banks in the provinces, and over 100 banks in London alone. The financial requirements to establish and maintain big industrial enterprises were met by these banks. The industrialization that occurred in Britain from the 1780s to the 1850s is explained partly by the factors described above: many poor people from the villages available to work in towns, banks which could loan money to set up large industries, and a good transport network. The following pages will describe two new factors: a range of technological changes that increased production levels dramatically and a new transport network created by the construction of railways. In both developments, if the dates are read carefully, one will notice that there is a gap of a few decades between the development and its widespread application. One must not assume that a new innovation in technology led to it being used in the industry immediately. Of the 26,000 inventions recorded in the 18th century, more than half were listed for the period 1782 to 1800. These led to many changes. We shall discuss the four major ones: the transformation of the iron industry, the spinning and weaving of cotton, the development of steam power, and the coming of the railways. Coal and iron. England was fortunate in that coal and iron ore, the staple materials for mechanization, were plentifully available, as were other minerals, lead, copper and tin, that were used in industry. However, until the 18th century, there was a scarcity of usable iron. Iron is drawn out from ore as pure liquid metal by a process called smelting. For centuries, charcoal, from burnt timber, was used for the smelting process. This had several problems. Charcoal was too fragile to transport across long distances, its impurities produced poor quality iron, it was in short supply because forests had been destroyed for timber, and it could not generate high temperatures. The solution to this problem had been sought for years before it was solved by a family of ironmasters, the Darbys of Shropshire. In the course of half a century, 3 generations of this family, grandfather, father and son, all called Abraham Darby, brought about a revolution in the metallurgical industry. It began with an invention in 1709 by the first Abraham Darby, 1677 to 1717. This was a blast furnace that would use coke, which could generate high temperatures. Coke was derived from coal by removing the sulfur and impurities. This invention meant that furnaces no longer had to depend on charcoal. The melted iron that emerged from these furnaces permitted finer and larger castings than before. The process was further refined by more inventions. The second Darby, 1711 to 68, developed wrought iron, which was less brittle, from pig iron. Henry Court, 1740 to 1823, designed the puddling furnace, in which molten iron could be rid of impurities, and the rolling mill, which used steam power to roll purified iron into bars. It now became possible to produce a broader range of iron products. The durability of iron made it a better material than wood for everyday items and for machinery. Unlike wood, which could burn or splinter, the physical and chemical properties of iron could be controlled. In the 1770s, John Wilkinson, 1728 to 1808, made the first iron chairs, vats for breweries and distilleries, and iron pipes of all sizes. In 1779, the third Darby, 1750 to 1791, built the first iron bridge in the world, in Coalbrookdale, spanning the River Severn. Wilkinson used cast iron for the first time to make water pipes, 40 miles of it for the water supply of Paris. The iron industry then came to be concentrated in specific regions as integrated units of coal mining and iron smelting. Britain was lucky in possessing excellent coking coal and high-grade iron ore in the same basins or even the same seams. These basins were also close to ports. There were 5 coastal coalfields which could deliver their products almost straight into ships. Since the coalfields were near the coast, shipbuilding increased, as did the shipping trade. The British iron industry quadrupled its output between 1800 and 1830, and its product was the cheapest in Europe. In 1820, a ton of pig iron needed 8 tons of coal to make it, but by 1850 it could be produced by using only 2 tons. By 1848, Britain was smelting more iron than the rest of the world put together. Cotton spinning and weaving. The British had always woven cloth out of wool and flax, to make linen. From the 17th century, the country had been importing bales of cotton cloth from India at great cost. As the East India Company's political control of parts of India was established, it began to import, along with cloth, raw cotton, which could be spun and woven into cloth in England. Till the early 18th century, spinning had been so slow and laborious that 10 spinners, mostly women, hence the word spinster, were required to supply sufficient yarn to keep a single weaver busy. Therefore, while spinners were occupied all day, weavers waited idly to receive yarn, but a series of technological inventions successfully closed the gap between the speed in spinning raw cotton into yarn or thread, and of weaving the yarn into fabric. To make it even more efficient, production gradually shifted from the homes of spinners and weavers to factories. From the 1780s, the cotton industry symbolized British industrialization in many ways. This industry had 2 features which were also seen in other industries. Raw cotton had to be entirely imported and a large part of the finished cloth was exported. This sustained the process of colonization, so that Britain could retain control over the sources of raw cotton as well as the markets. The industry was heavily dependent on the work of women and children in factories. This exemplified the ugly face of early industrialization, as will be described below. Steam power. The realization that steam could generate tremendous power was decisive to large-scale industrialization. Water as hydraulic power had been the prime source of energy for centuries, but it had been limited to certain areas, seasons and by the speed of flow of the water. Now it was used differently. Steam power provided pressure at high temperatures that enabled the use of a broad range of machinery. This meant that steam power was the only source of energy that was reliable and inexpensive enough to manufacture machinery itself. Steam power was first used in mining industries. As the demand for coal and metals expanded, efforts to obtain them from ever deeper mines intensified. Flooding in mines was a serious problem. Thomas Savery, 1650 to 1715, built a model steam engine called the Miner's Friend in 1698 to drain mines. These engines worked slowly, in shallow depths, and the boiler burst under too much pressure. Another steam engine was built by Thomas Newcomen, 1663 to 1729, in 1712. This had the major defect of losing energy due to continuous cooling of the condensing cylinder. The steam engine had been used only in coal mines until James Watt, 1736 to 1819, developed his machine in 1769. Watt's invention converted the steam engine from being a mere pump into a prime mover, capable of providing energy to power machines in factories. Backed by the wealthy manufacturer Matthew Boulton, 1728 to 1809, Watt created the Soho Foundry in Birmingham in 1775. From this foundry, Watt's steam engines were produced in steadily growing numbers. By the end of the 18th century, Watt's steam engine was beginning to replace hydraulic power. After 1800, steam engine technology was further developed with the use of lighter, stronger metals, the manufacture of more accurate machine tools, and the spread of better scientific knowledge. In 1840, British steam engines were generating more than 70% of all European horsepower. Canals and railways. Canals were initially built to transport coal to cities. This was because the bulk and weight of coal made its transport by road much slower and more expensive than by barges on canals. The demand for coal, as industrial energy and for heating and lighting homes in cities, grew constantly. The making of the first English canal, the Worsley Canal, 1761, by James Brindley, 1716 to 1772, had no other purpose than to carry coal from the coal deposits at Worsley, near Manchester, to that city. After the canal was completed, the price of coal fell by half. Canals were usually built by big landowners to increase the value of the mines. Quarries are forests on their lands. The confluence of canals created marketing centers in new towns. The city of Birmingham, for example, owed its growth to its position at the heart of a canal system connecting London, the Bristol Channel, and the Mersey and Humber rivers. From 1760 to 1790, 25 new canal building projects were begun. In the period known as the Canalmania, from 1788 to 1796, there were another 46 new projects, and over the next 60 years more than 4,000 miles of canal were built. The first steam locomotive, Stephenson's rocket, appeared in 1814. Railways emerged as a new means of transportation that was available throughout the year, both cheap and fast, to carry passengers and goods. They combined two inventions, the iron track, which replaced the wooden track in the 1760s, and haulage along it by steam engine. The invention of the railways took the entire process of industrialization to a second stage. In 1801, Richard Trevithick, 1771 to 1833, had devised an engine called the Puffing Devil that pulled trucks around the mine where he worked in Cornwall. In 1814, the railway engineer George Stephenson, 1781 to 1848, constructed a locomotive, called the Blucher, that could pull a weight of 30 tons up a hill at 4 miles per hour. The first railway line connected the cities of Stockton and Darlington in 1825, a distance of 9 miles that was completed in 2 hours at speeds of up to 24 kph, 15 meters ph, and the next railway line connected Liverpool and Manchester in 1830. Within 20 years, speeds of 30 to 50 miles an hour were usual. In the 1830s, the use of canals revealed several problems. The congestion of vessels made movement slow on certain stretches of canals, and frost, flood or drought limited the time of their use. The railways now appeared as a convenient alternative. About 6,000 miles of railway was opened in Britain between 1830 and 1850, most of it in 2 short bursts. During the Little Railway Mania of 1833 to 37, 1,400 miles of line was built, and during the Bigger Mania of 1844 to 1847, another 9,500 miles of line was sanctioned. They used vast amounts of coal and iron, employed large numbers of workers, and boosted activity in the construction and public works industries. Most of England had been connected by railway by 1850. Changed lives in these years, therefore, it was possible for individuals with talent to bring about revolutionary changes. Similarly, there were rich individuals who took risks and invested money in industries in the hope that profits could be made, and that their money would multiply. In most cases, this money, capital, did multiply. Wealth, in the form of goods, incomes, services, knowledge and productive efficiency, did increase dramatically. There was, at the same time, a massive negative human cost. This was evident in broken families, new addresses, degraded cities and appalling working conditions in factories. The number of cities in England with a population of over 50,000 grew from 2 in 1750 to 29 in 1850. This pace of growth was not matched with the provision of adequate housing, sanitation or clean water for the rapidly growing urban population. Newcomers were forced to live in overcrowded slums in the congested central areas of towns near factories, while the rich inhabitants escaped, by shifting to homes in the suburbs where the air was cleaner and the water safe to drink. The Workers' A survey in 1842 revealed that the average lifespan of workers was lower than that of any other social group in cities. It was 15 years in Birmingham, 17 in Manchester, 21 in Derby. More people died, and died at a younger age, in the new industrial cities, than in the villages they had come from. Half the children failed to survive beyond the age of 5. The increase in the population of cities was because of immigrants, rather than by an increase in the number of children born to families who already lived there. Deaths were primarily caused by epidemics of disease that sprang from the pollution of water, like cholera and typhoid, or of the air, like tuberculosis. More than 31,000 people died from an outbreak of cholera in 1832. Until late in the 19th century, municipal authorities were negligent in attending to these dangerous conditions of life, and the medical knowledge to understand and cure these diseases was unknown. Women, children and industrialization. The Industrial Revolution was a time of important changes in the way that children and women worked. Children of the rural poor had always worked at home or in the farm at jobs that varied during the day or between seasons, under the watchful eye of parents or relatives. Likewise, in villages women were actively involved in farm work. They reared livestock, gathered firewood and spun yarn on spinning wheels in their homes. Work in the factories, with long, unbroken hours of the same kind of work, under strict discipline and sharp forms of punishment, was completely different. The earnings of women and children were necessary to supplement men's meager wages. As the use of machinery spread, and fewer workers were needed, industrialists preferred to employ women and children who would be less agitated about their poor working conditions and work for lower wages than men. They were employed in large numbers in the cotton textile industry in Lancashire and Yorkshire. Women were also the main workers in the silk, lace-making and knitting industries, as well as, along with children, in the metal industries of Birmingham. Machinery like the cotton spinning jenny was designed to be used by child workers with their small build and nimble fingers. Children were often employed in textile factories because they were small enough to move between tightly packed machinery. The long hours of work, including cleaning the machines on Sundays, allowed them little fresh air or exercise. Children caught their hair in machines or crushed their hands, while some died when they fell into machines as they dropped off to sleep from exhaustion. Coal mines were also dangerous places to work in. Roofs caved in or there could be an explosion, and injuries were therefore common. The owners of coal mines used children to reach deep coal faces or those where the approach path was too narrow for adults. Younger children worked as trappers who opened and shut doors as the coal wagons traveled through mines, or carried heavy loads of coal on their backs as coal bearers. Factory managers considered child labor to be important training for future factory work. The evidence from British factory records reveals that about half of the factory workers had started work when they were less than 10 years old and 28% when they were under. Women may well have gained increased financial independence and self-esteem from their jobs, but this was more than offset by the humiliating terms of work they endured, the children they lost at birth or in early childhood, and the squalid urban slums that industrial work compelled them to live in. Protest movements. The early decades of industrialization coincided with the spread of new political ideas pioneered by the French Revolution, 1789 to 1794. The movements for liberty, equality and fraternity showed the possibilities of collective mass action, both in creating democratic institutions like the French parliamentary assemblies of the 1790s, and in checking the worst hardships of war by controlling the prices of necessities like bread. In England, political protest against the harsh working conditions in factories kept increasing, and the working population agitated to be given the right to vote. The government reacted by repression and by new laws that denied people the right to protest. England had been at war with France for a long time, from 1792 to 1815. trade between England and Europe was disrupted, factories were forced to shut down, unemployment grew and the price of essential items of food, like bread and meat, soared to heights beyond the level of average wages. Parliament in 1795 passed two combination acts which made it illegal to incite the people by speech or writing to hatred or contempt of the king, constitution or government, and banned unauthorized public meetings of over 50 persons. Protest, nonetheless, continued against old corruption. This term was used for privileges linked to the monarchy and parliament. Members of parliament, landowners, manufacturers and professionals, were opposed to giving the working population the right to vote. They supported the Corn Laws, which prevented the import of cheaper food until prices in Britain had risen to a certain level. As workers flooded towns and factories, they expressed their anger and frustration in numerous forms of protest. There were bread or food riots throughout the country from the 1790s onwards. Bread was the staple item in the diet of the poor and its price governed their standard of living. Stocks of bread were seized and sold at a price that was affordable and morally correct rather than at the high prices charged by profit-hungry traders. Such riots were particularly frequent in the worst year of the war, 1795, but they continued until